thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for having me on stage here at the Frog Conference. And especially to you, Natalie, for letting me have a bit of a late entry. And when I heard about the topic, I knew I just had to have a talk about freedom and empowerment in gaming. And I also want to especially thank my girlfriend, who immediately came up with the topic and said, well, I mean, some of the most oppressed people, the tribes in the Americas, what's up with the whole casino business and gambling. And since she also like designed the bag for my game, I just thought I just had to thank her, because this is an amazing story about gaming as a way for sovereignty. Instead of what we usually know as, you know, having a standing army and like physical force to undermine that. And she also told me, like, if you do this in somewhat scientific way later on, it's best to compare it. So I'll try to compare it, the United States dealing with it and Canada. So I'll start with the United States, who started everything. And it doesn't go to the other way. Where's the mouse? Sorry. So I will start with the United States, but I didn't think about how that will look actually on stage. So I'm not gonna sing the national anthem or run for president right now. So when I come here as an Austrian European, I wanted to check at first what terminology I will use for the cultural people I'll be talking about, because we all know about Indians, the great historical mistake by Christopher Columbus, who wanted to reach India by going west and then just said, "Well, you're Indians," and of course that is historically wrong. And really, in America, the discussion only started with the whole cultural movements of the 60s and civil rights movements, when pretty much out of the liberal universities, the term Native Americans was formed. But however, that in some way, America is as well just named after Americano Vespucci, another European sailor. And from US legal status, I mean, it's you have birthright citizenship. So if your parents are from Korea or somewhere else you're born in the United States, you're a native. So I was pretty surprised that in all legal documents and all the podcasters and researchers of most native tribes, I found the common terminology for the umbrella term remains Indian. Everybody uses Indian. So I thought it's only fair that we also use the umbrella term for European colonialists that the tribes use. So we're going to use the white man. And this, I think, is a wonderful American way to start, like, from a cultural war kind of thing that's so emotionally charged. And when we look at Canada, on the other hand, they have been in the 80s terming the much nicer and I mean academic took the academic approach, and there we know it as First Nations, and that really hits the nail on the head when it comes to talking about tribes on the continent, because before the white man's arrival, I mean, it was just hundreds of tribes, and they were in different cultural spheres, you know, combined together in different languages, but having their own sovereignty. They would trade with each other, they'd fight with each other, you know, just like how we used it from the whole planet. But when the white man arrived, of course, everything changed very rapidly. But the interesting thing is, when the United States Constitution was written in 1787, 6, 9, something like that, the foreign relations with Indian tribes was just like with other foreign nations. So they were treated with sovereignty, and you would make a contract with Cherokees or yes? Oh, the online people don't hear. I have to look this way. And so yes, this is how the tribes were, at least on paper, dealt with as sovereign foreign nations. Now, the westwards expansion, of course, went very rapidly, and the native tribes were assimilated very quickly. But the key concept of it is that when we talk about Indian reservations in the United States, they retain the right to sovereignty. So they still are legally nations on eye level, theoretically, with the federal government, even though they share the same territorial lands with other states. And of course, these the way they're located now is the biggest lands they have been assigned throughout history of oppression, of assigning them the least fruitful lands. And there have been programs of assimilation, of forceful displacement all along, but these are really other topics. And I want to focus on how the tribes then actually got got out of it, because sovereignty is one thing. If you don't have any power to enforce it, it's really just on paper and it can be pushed around. And it really changed in only in 1987, actually the year I was born, when a tribe called the Cabazon Band opened up a high-stake game of bingo in California and was sued by the state of California, who were saying, well, you know, we don't allow this kind of gambling. And especially at this time in the United States, gambling was still pretty much illegal anywhere in the United States except for Las Vegas. And the Cabazon Band went all the way to the Supreme Court with that. And the Supreme Court said pretty much the Cabazon Band is right. It's on their sovereign turf. They can make their own rules, completely different to what the territorial state they're in are. So they always had the complete right to offer gambling, high stakes gambling, however they please. I mean, this also, on other issues, this also concerns marijuana or hallucinogenic drugs. And this really opened the door for tribes to say, wow, I mean, we might have a way to get back cash from the white man, because they all pilger from all over the country to this mecca of Las Vegas to just throw their money in. And it spread rapidly. Like tribes all started to open casinos on their own hands. And just as rapidly, the federal government stepped in and said, oh, wow, we got to regulate this. And they founded, just within less than a year, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988. That pretty much mandated that Indian gaming was pretty much only allowed if gaming was legal in the states as well. And they had to find what they call compacts, contracts with these states on a certain level. And they also categorized it in class 1 gaming, traditional cultural Indian games, lotteries, bingos as class 2, which was also somewhat common among churches to raise money, and class 3, of course, casino games. Now, even though this was actually a limit on their sovereign right to self-determination, what IGRA also did was that it actually provided protection by the federal government from organized crime. So just to spoil this, it's an amazing success story, and everything that is typically associated in the United States with gambling and the mafia and the shady business, completely not the case. I mean, you'd have some lost funds, but overall, it's the money funded through casinos really directly goes to the tribes operating them to build up their communities. But even more important, they provided the protection from the states, so that they really said, it kind of gave these tribes a little bit of a seat at the federal government, at the big chief, to protect them from the states from pushing them around, to say the states don't have any say in what the tribes can do. And if so, they would have to negotiate that among them. So just to give you a little bit of data, and I'm not the biggest graphic designer. So, but by now, by 2021, the tribal casinos generate $39 billion in cash per year untaxed, because the states are not allowed to tax even that income. And that amounts to 40% of all gambling income in the United States, which is bigger than Las Vegas and Atlantic City combined. So this is huge. Like within less than a generation, they managed to find a way to get a huge fiscal independence. Now, of course, this does not benefit every tribe. Not every tribe is in gambling. There are also this is a whole nother issue. There's still hundreds of unrecognized tribes in the United States. But of the 574 recognized tribes, 242 are part of the Indian Gaming Association and partake in gambling. And of those, pretty much only 1/3 actually turn a profit. So yes, this is, but I mean, this is America. I mean, it's not, the money doesn't go to everybody, the money goes to the people who make it. And for those who make it, these around 10 to 15% of like 200, 300, 500, 400, 500 million. It's really, one needs to keep in mind, this does not go to like the big managers of the casinos. This goes to a nation. And when you think about that, this is like 500, let's say this is $300 million. That's, let's say, a somewhat amount of cash you need to build your own roads, your own schools, hospitals, and so on. So this really was the great success story for some tribes to regain sovereignty and independence, not through a violent revolution, but through gambling, through gaming. And then I thought, okay, now if I have to compare that with Canada, I divided the whole like net revenue of all gambling through the population of the US, which amounts to actually $277 per person per year, including all infants, okay, and everybody. So I mean, just think about that. And when I compared it to Canada, whoa, Canadians actually gamble even way more than United States. I didn't know that. And I didn't think about that. And much later on, and really just recently, the Indians casino amounted for roughly $1 billion of the 15 million in revenue. And they're really only, this revenue only really comes from 16 casinos in 5 territories of Canada. So it's a very small amount of tribes actually engaging in casino operation in Canada. And you may think, well, you know, maybe Canada's much different. It's not that vibrant gambling culture. Maybe just a lot of tribes don't want that, and isn't like a 6% revenue perfectly fair for a 5% population. That's really not how the Indians see it. And it's structurally also a bit different because, as was before, in the United States, the states have no say, and the tribes have some sort of protection from the highest level of federal states, governments. In Canada, until 1966, all gambling regulation was in the monopoly of the whole federal government of Canada. And when a tribe tried to negotiate for that, they would really have to deal with big guys. Actually not guys. And that changed in 1966, where the federal government gave that power to these individual provinces to negotiate with tribes on their terms. And now, why did that happen? And this is something that really amazed me and kind of shocked me, because there's also a legal precedent to that. And that in Canada, a tribe, I will not pronounce it right now, also tried to operate casino lines, and again, got sued by the federal government, which in Canada, of course, is Her Majesty the Queen, and that they were guilty as charged on all offenses. And they pleaded, again, they said, well, gambling is like independent gambling operations is illegal. It's in the hands of Canada. And of course, the tribes also argued for their sovereignty. It's on our reservation lands. We have a right to determine ourselves, just like it's done in the United States. And the Supreme Court of Canada said, no, you're not. And this is especially visible in the third point, where it specifically says, the intention of the Crown to extinguish the Shawanga First Nations right of self-government has been clearly and plainly expressed. In other words, Canada says, no sovereignty for you. And with 1996, there was another case of Van der Peet, which developed a list, a cultural distinction test that tribes had to fulfill in order to say, yes, this has been part of our culture. We have always been doing that. And I think that, especially for us concerned with game studies, I think, first of all, this is a profound thing, because the argument is not, this is immoral, or this is of an economic threat, but it is deeply associated with the culture. And because I only had that much space, I only picked 5 of them, but it is so detailed that you have to have a claim, first of all, to be specific rather than general, and that they have to provide proof that this exact custom had to have existed prior to contact with the white man. In other words, tribes would have to say, oh yes, of course, like when the white man came, we offered them the peace pipe and our latest slot machine, and we'd accept Canadian dollars. Of course, this is legally impossible. And this really shows that how Canada, and especially how this document treats natives. First of all, the right to sovereign self-determination is clearly questioned. And after that, it's pretty much saying, well, we're the developed people and we like to keep developing, but we like to help you preserve your culture and stay undeveloped, right? So pretty much anything cultural Indian reservation for Canada is treated more like a glass container and say, okay, you can stay there if you keep the way you have been before we came. And again, when I thought about this legal argument that you'd have to provide cultural proof, I just had to think about Huitzinga and the Homo Ludens. And I'd actually wanted to read the specifics. And he had this chapter about play and contest in civilizing functions, and especially focusing largely on a tradition called the potlatch, which is widely practiced by a lot of tribes. And he writes, at the potlatch, the families or clans are at their best, singing their sacred songs, exhibiting their masks, while the medicine men demonstrate the possession of the clan spirits. But the main thing is the distribution of goods. The feast taking part in the feast, the other clans incurs the obligation to give a potlatch on a still grander scale. Should it fail to do so, it forfeits its name, its honor, its badge, and totems, even its civil and religious rights. So it's serious. This is a serious cultural practice. And the potlatch in Canada was made illegal throughout the 40s and 50s until it had to be abandoned because there was just so much resistance from the tribes. And he further observes the potlatch and everything connected with it hinges on winning, on being superior, on glory, prestige, and last but not least, revenge. Always, even when only one person in the feast giver, there are two groups standing in opposition, but bound by a spirit of hostility and friendship combined. I mean, we know this from gaming, right? We compete with each other, but all in friendship. In order to understand this ambivalent attitude, we must recognize that the essential feature of the potlatch is the winning of it. And he quotes Mouse and Davy, who observed that the practice, the potlatch likens the communities that practice it to big gambling dens, where as a result of bets and challenges, reputations are made and whole fortunes exchange hands. So pretty much he observed that the play spirit and in a gambling spirit, that this boasting matches, how we call them, how appeared all over the world, from China to pre-Islamic Arabia to Greek and Roman cultures, even Germanic ones. So this is really like observed all over the world in tribal settings, this sort of wagering and wagering contests. So I think as from like a game studies perspective, this kind of really has to help in saying the gambling and gaming is really something of 100% native nations. And because I just don't know how much time we have, 5 minutes, then I'll just cut it right here, because I had these. I also had these other stories about these most prestigious American presidents, and just a spoiler, they were all heavy gamblers. Even though for most of the history of the United States, gambling was illegal by the Puritan and evangelical politics, and I would argue that gambling is something so 100% American and so 100% First Nation culture, that if we think about it from a perspective of power, how about a wild just reconciliation idea to say, oh, well, the traditional power of force remains in the United States, make the best killing machines in the world. But how about turning over a gambling monopoly to the First Nations to provide them for their own their own power to sustain themselves and be sovereign nations, that they actually are. So with that, I'd like to close and thank you for attention and say, well, keep gaming for freedom.